The boy had no name anyone cared to remember. He had once, long ago, when his mother whispered it in soft tones at night, and his father called it sharp across the fields at chore time. But those voices had been swallowed by fever, taken from the world before winter's thaw. Now to the settlers on the far side of the ridge, he was simply the orphan. To the passing wagons, he was nothing at all. For weeks he had wandered, chasing scraps of food and fleeing shadows. Hunger gnawed at him, each step lighter than the last, as his ribs pressed harder against his skin. He had grown used to silence, used to no hand reaching for his, used to the way people looked through him as if he were a ghost, walking among the living. Yet he pressed forward, driven by something deeper than reason. A stubborn refusal to lie down and join the bones that already littered the prairie. The wilderness had become both his enemy and his only companion. The towering pines stretched endlessly above, their whispering needles carrying secrets he could not understand. He drank from streams cold enough to crack his teeth, gathered berries when he could, and when nothing else came, he chewed on strips of bark to trick his stomach into thinking it wasn't empty. That was when he saw him. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree, a dark shape tangled among the roots and earth. But as he drew closer, the smell hit him. Blood, sweat, and smoke mingling in the air. The shape moved, ever so slightly, with the shallow rise and fall of breath. The stranger lay sprawled on the forest floor, his chest heaving faintly. His long black hair, once smooth, was matted with dust and streaked with crimson. His buckskin shirt was torn and stiff with dried blood. Across his ribs, an angry wound split the flesh, still fresh enough to shine wet in the morning light. The boy froze. He had been warned long ago about men like this. Natives, warriors, the people settlers whispered about at night with voices dipped in fear. Yet as the boy looked at the stranger, bleeding out in the dirt, all he saw was the same thing he carried in himself, the face of someone left behind. He hesitated. His heart hammered, telling him to run, to vanish back into the pines before the man woke and struck him down. But another voice, softer and steadier, spoke from somewhere deep inside. The same voice that had urged him to keep walking when his legs wanted to quit. The boy knelt. He pressed his small hands against the wound, not knowing if it would help, only knowing it was all he could do. The man's skin burned with fever. His breathing rattled like dry leaves, shallow and broken. The boy had seen death before, in the sunken eyes of his mother and the cold silence of his father. He knew enough to see that this man was close to slipping away, unless someone cared enough to stop it. With trembling hands, he crawled to the nearby stream. He cupped the icy water, spilling half of it before reaching the man's lips. At first, nothing happened. The water dripped down, soaking into the dirt. The boy tried again, this time steadying his hands. A few drops touched the man's mouth. Then, with a groan as low as thunder, the stranger swallowed. The boy's breath caught, dark eyes flickered open, clouded with pain but sharp enough to notice the child hovering above him. For a long, heavy moment, they only stared at one another, the orphan with nothing to give, and the warrior with nothing left to lose. And in that silence, the boy realized something. For the first time since the fever took his parents, someone was looking at him as if he mattered. The man's eyes stayed fixed on the boy, sharp yet heavy, like embers struggling to stay alive in fading coals. His lips cracked as he tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped. The boy, unsure if the man's gaze was a plea or a warning, shifted nervously, yet didn't back away. He cupped his hands again, filling them with the stream's cold bite, and returned. Kneeling, he tilted his palms carefully toward the man's lips. This time, the warrior drank deeper. Though the water turned pink as it mixed with blood on his chin, he coughed, the sound jagged and harsh. But when his chest rose again, it was steadier than before. The boy wiped his wet hands against his ragged shirt and sat back, watching. He didn't know what to do next. He was no doctor. He wasn't even much of a boy anymore. Just skin, bone, and stubbornness. But something about the man lying in the dirt stirred a spark inside him. Perhaps it was the way the warrior's strength still clung to him, even in weakness. Or perhaps it was the simple fact that for once, someone needed him. The boy glanced around the clearing. The forest was still, but the stillness carried weight. He felt the unseen eyes of predators. Wolves, maybe even men, lurking just beyond the trees. Whoever had cut this man down might still be near. He should run. That thought hammered in his mind. Yet each time he looked at the wounded stranger, he stayed. The man groaned, shifting slightly, and his hand twitched against the ground. Slowly, he lifted it, trying to reach the wound at his ribs. The boy moved closer, pressing his small hands gently over the torn flesh. He had no bandages, no medicines, nothing but dirty cloth and the will to try. He tore a strip from his shirt, tying it around the gash as tightly as his shaking hands allowed. The man's jaw clenched, but he did not push the boy away. "Shh," the boy whispered, though he knew the man likely couldn't understand. "It'll be all right. You'll be all right." He wasn't sure if he was lying. Hours passed in fragments of silence and shallow breaths. The boy fetched water again and again, lifting it patiently to the man's lips. He searched the undergrowth for berries, returning with a handful of red, ones that stained his palms. He offered them, but the man shook his head faintly. The boy ate them himself, chewing slowly, pretending they were enough for two. As the sun dipped, shadows stretched long across the clearing. The boy gathered fallen branches and struck flint against stone until sparks caught, coaxing a small fire into life. He sat beside the man, feeding the flames, eyes darting toward the darkness where the forest thickened. The fire's crackle seemed too loud, too bright, but it was better than the silence. The man's breathing deepened with the night, not strong, but no longer shallow enough to make the boy panic. At one point, the warrior turned his head slightly, his eyes half open, and looked again at the boy. There was no anger in the gaze, no fear, only something steady, something that made the boy's chest feel less hollow. Neither spoke the other's tongue, yet words weren't needed. A quiet bond had been struck in that clearing, forged not by blood or family, but by survival. The boy pulled his knees to his chest, staring at the fire. He wondered who this man was. A warrior, a hunter, someone with people searching for him even now. The boy didn't know. What he did know was simple. If he left, the man would die. And though the world had turned its back on him, the boy refused to do the same. When he finally lay down, the man's breathing beside him was a rhythm in the night, and for the first time in months, the orphan slept with the strange comfort of not being alone. The boy woke to the sound of crows. Their calls carried through the pines like mocking laughter, echoing over the clearing where the fire had burned to ash. He rubbed his eyes, stiff from the cold ground, and for a moment forgot where he was. Then he saw the man. The warrior still lay where he had fallen, but his chest rose and fell with a steadier rhythm now. His skin was pale beneath the morning light, yet there was strength hidden in the set of his jaw. Even in sleep, the boy felt a flicker of pride. He had kept him alive through the night. He gathered more water and coaxed the man to drink. This time the warrior swallowed with less struggle, his eyes opening briefly to meet the boy's. No words were exchanged, but the boy thought he saw a faint nod, as though the man understood and, in his own way, gave thanks. The boy almost smiled, until the forest spoke again. It was subtle at first, a branch snapping in the distance, the rustle of undergrowth not caused by wind. The boy's stomach twisted. He had lived long enough, on the edges of hunger and fear, to know the difference between the movements of animals and the silence of men. Someone was out there, watching. He glanced around quickly, scanning the tall pines. Their shadows fell long and sharp across the ground, perfect for hiding eyes he couldn't see. The crows had gone quiet now, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The boy gripped a fallen stick, brittle, barely heavier than a switch. But it was all he had. He stood over the warrior's body, heart pounding, and tried to look braver than he felt. Minutes stretched. He thought he saw shapes moving between the trees, flashes of color against bark. But each time he blinked, they were gone. His throat felt dry. Whoever had done this to the man could be returning to finish the job. If they found the boy too, the warrior stirred. His eyes opened, catching the boy's fear. Slowly, with great effort, he raised his hand and pointed. Not to the boy, but to the trees. His lips parted and a single word escaped, low and heavy. The boy couldn't understand it, but the tone said enough. Danger. The orphan crouched, lower, dragging another branch onto the dying fire, feeding it until the flames leapt higher. He remembered stories of wolves and cougars kept at bay by firelight. But this didn't feel like wolves. This felt heavier, more human. The shadows lingered until the sun climbed higher, breaking the forest gloom. Then, just as suddenly as the presence had come, it slipped away. The boy wasn't sure if he imagined it, or if whoever had been watching chose to leave. Either way, the knot in his stomach remained. All day he stayed close to the warrior. He brought water, chewed berries, and whispered small words into the silence, not caring if the man understood. Talking made the fear feel smaller. By dusk, the warrior was stronger. He sat up, leaning against a fallen log, sweat beading on his brow, but eyes sharper than before. He studied the boy as though weighing something unseen. The orphan met the gaze, unflinching despite the tremor in his hands. Night came again. The boy fed the fire, his ears tuned to every crack of twig, every whisper of pine. He thought of the settlers who had turned him away, the empty cabins, the graves he'd left behind. He realized that, in some strange way, he was less afraid, here beside the wounded man, than he had ever been in the company of his own kind. Still, unease clung to him like the cold, for though the forest now lay quiet, he knew in his bones that the shadows he had glimpsed were not done with them. And by the time the first stars cut through the branches, the boy sensed that the night ahead would bring more than silence. The boy barely slept that night. Each time his eyes closed, the memory of shadows in the trees dragged them open again. He fed the fire, listening for the snap of twigs, the soft crush of leaves, any sign that the forest's silence was about to break. By the time dawn pushed its pale light through the pines, his head sagged with exhaustion. He glanced at the man. The warrior had not moved much, though his breathing was steadier, his face set in a grim mask of endurance. The boy felt something strange at that sight, a pride he had no right to claim, yet carried like a secret flame. He had kept him alive another night. The morning was still when it happened. The ground trembled first, a faint shiver beneath the earth, too steady for wolves, too heavy for wind. Then came the sound. Hooves, horses, dozens, maybe more. The boy's stomach lurched as he scrambled to his feet. From the trees, they emerged. One rider, then another, then 10 more, until the forest seemed to spill them forth, like a river breaking. Its banks, warriors, painted faces, feathers bound in braids, rifles slung across their backs. The boy froze as the clearing filled with them. Not 10 or 20, but a flood. 100, maybe 2. The air itself seemed to shrink beneath their presence. The boy's first thought was to run, but his legs held him rooted. His second thought was worse. If they found the wounded man here, they might think the boy had done it. He glanced at the warrior, still weak, unable to defend himself. If the boy left, the man would surely die. So he did the only thing his small, trembling body could manage. He stepped in front of him. The stick in his hand was laughable. No more threat than a twig. Yet he held it tight, shoulders squared, facing the tide of riders with his chin high. His heart pounded so hard, he thought they must hear it, but he refused to move. The warriors encircled the clearing, their horses stamping the ground, breath fogging in the cool morning air. Their eyes cut toward the boy. Not kind, not cruel, but sharp and measuring. One rider dismounted. He was tall, broader than the others, his hair bound with a single eagle feather, his face marked with red and black paint. His steps were deliberate as he approached. The boy's grip on the stick tightened until his knuckles turned white. The painted man stopped before him, eyes narrowing at the sight of the wounded warrior lying behind. He crouched low, his gaze flicking between the boy and the fallen man. He spoke, words in a tongue the boy could not understand, but the tone carried weight. The boy swallowed hard. "I didn't hurt him," he whispered, though he knew the man wouldn't know the words. His voice shook anyway. "I helped him." The warrior studied him in silence, then reached forward, testing the bandage wrapped clumsily around the man's ribs. His fingers brushed the rough knots tied with a child's care. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked at the boy again. A pause, then a nod. The boy blinked, not sure he understood, but the tension in the circle shifted. The riders' eyes softened, some lowering their rifles. The painted man rose and spoke again, his voice carrying to the others. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The orphan's legs nearly gave way with relief. Though he dared not move, he turned back to the warrior he had saved, who now met his gaze with something fierce, something unspoken, yet undeniable. He had not only found a man in the woods, he had found his people, and the trial of trust had only just begun. The village stirred with life as the boy entered its heart. Flanked by riders on horseback, smoke curled from dozens of fires, the smell of roasted venison mixing with pine and earth. Hides stretched across poles. Women worked with grinding stones, and children darted between the lodges with shrill laughter. But as the orphan walked past, the laughter faded. Every pair of eyes turned toward him, dark, questioning, some sharp with suspicion, others softened with curiosity. He felt their stares like arrows in his back. He kept his head down, clinging to the thought that the man he had saved was near. The wounded warrior was carried into one of the larger lodges, his body laid upon furs, his wound rebandaged with far greater skill than the boy's clumsy knots. The orphan lingered near the doorway, peering inside whenever he dared. He had no words for these people, no language to explain what he had done or why. All he could do was wait. As evening fell, drums sounded low and steady across the camp. Warriors gathered around the central fire, their faces lit by the red glow. Elders sat among them, their hair silvered, their eyes deep as river stones. The boy was pulled into the circle, his small body cast in shadow against the flames. He wanted to run, but something in the air held him still. This was no trial by rope or rifle. This was judgment of another kind. Voices rose around him. The elders spoke first, their words slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of age. Though he could not understand the language, the boy knew the debate was about him. Hands pointed, voices lifted, some sharp as the crack of firewood, others softer, persuasive. One elder's tone made the boy shrink. The words cut like a whip, and when the old man's finger stabbed the air in his direction, the orphan knew he was being called a trespasser, an intruder. Another voice rose in his defense, the tone warmer, gesturing toward the lodge where the wounded warrior rested. The boy's chest tightened. He had no defense to offer, no family name, no place he belonged. All he had was the truth of what he had done. He had seen a man dying, and he had refused to leave him. But truth meant little when you had no voice to speak it. The debate swelled until the air trembled with it. Then a sound split the night, a voice from the lodge. The wounded warrior stood in the doorway, pale but upright, leaning heavily against the frame. His body swayed with weakness, but his eyes burned steady as the fire. The crowd fell silent. He spoke, slow, rough words, but words that carried like a command. The boy's heart pounded, straining to catch their meaning. The man's gaze never left him, even as the language flowed from his lips. The orphan could not understand, but he felt it in his bones. The warrior was speaking for him. When he finished, silence hung thick. Then, one by one, heads began to nod. Some reluctantly, others with conviction. The elder who had spoken harshly still scowled, but even he did not protest further. The painted leader stepped forward, his shadow long against the firelight. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, heavy but not unkind. In broken English, he spoke the words that sealed the decision. "You saved one of ours. Now you are one of us." The boy's throat tightened, his eyes stinging with a feeling he hadn't known in years. Belonging. Not bought, not begged for, but earned. As the fire roared higher and voices rose in song, the orphan realized the truth. For the first time since death had stolen his family, he was no longer alone. Dawn broke over the village like a quiet promise. Smoke drifted from the dying fires, curling into the pale sky as children's laughter returned to the air. The boy stirred from the ear, blanket someone had draped across him in the night. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then the memory rushed back. The circle of warriors, the wounded man's voice, the hand on his shoulder. He sat up, blinking at the camp, now alive with motion. Women carried baskets. Warriors saddled horses. Dogs barked and darted between lodges. And in all of it, no one looked at him with suspicion anymore. Some glanced his way with curiosity, even with faint smiles. But it was the sound of drums that pulled him to his feet. At the center of the village, the warriors had gathered again, 200 strong, their painted faces solemn, their eyes fixed on the boy as he was led toward them. His steps faltered, his throat dry, but he walked forward all the same. The painted leader, the tall man with the eagle feather, stood waiting. The boy lowered his gaze, clutching at his ragged shirt, wondering if this was another trial. But then the leader spoke in English, his words rough, yet clear. "You are small," he said, "but your heart is not." He gestured toward the crowd. "You gave water when others would turn away. You held life when death was near. For that, you are not outsider. You are family." The warriors answered with a low rumble, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The boy's chest swelled, his heart beating faster. Then the wounded warrior stepped forward. His steps were slow, his body still frail. But he stood tall, his head high. When he reached the boy, he knelt, placing a hand over the child's chest. He spoke words in his own tongue, strong despite his weakness. The crowd answered with a chant, voices lifting together like wind through the trees. The boy didn't understand the language, but he felt the meaning deep inside. He had been claimed. He belonged. For the first time since sickness stole his parents, he had a home. Not a cabin, not walls of timber, but something far greater. A people. 200 warriors. Their wives. Their children. Their elders. He was no longer an orphan in the pines. That night, the campfire blazed high in celebration. Meat roasted over flames. Songs rose into the stars. And dancers moved in rhythm with the drums. Children tugged at his hands, drawing him into their games. Women pressed food into his palms until his stomach ached from fullness. The boy laughed, a sound he had nearly forgotten he could make. Yet as the firelight flickered against the trees, he saw something in the eyes of the warriors that told him this was not the end of his journey, but only the beginning. They had accepted him, yes, but shadows still lingered beyond the pines. Whoever had left their brother bleeding in the dirt might one day return. The boy looked across the fire at the wounded warrior, who now sat among his people, head lifted with pride. Despite his injuries, their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, the boy understood danger still lived out there, but he would not face it alone. The drums beat faster, the fire roared higher, and the boy closed his eyes, letting the warmth wash over him. For the first time, the cold of the world had been pushed away. He had a place, a name unspoken, but carried, in the hearts of 200 warriors. And in that wild country, under the endless stars, the orphan found not just survival, but a family, a purpose, and a home.